3 days before my son was supposed to bury my husband, my neighbor of 32 years knocked on my back door and said, "Sylvia, don't sign anything tonight. Please, just trust me." I remember standing in my kitchen holding a dish towel I hadn't used. The casseroles were lined up on the counter, the ones people had been bringing since Edmund passed. Green bean, tuna noodle, something with sweet potato on top. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. My son-in-law, Gordon, had arrived that morning with folders under his arm. He said there were things that needed to be handled quickly. Estate matters. He used the word efficiently 3 times before noon. I told my neighbor Helen to come inside. She sat at my kitchen table the way she had 1,000 times over 32 years, but she wasn't herself. Her hands were shaking. "I was walking Biscuit past your side yard this morning," she said. "Gordon was on his phone by the oak tree. He didn't see me." She stopped, looked at her hands. "What did he hear?" I asked. I meant to say, "What did you hear?" but my mind was already somewhere else. "He was talking to your daughter," she said, "about the house, about the pension, about how you're not thinking clearly right now and that this is the time to move on the paperwork." I sat down. Edmund had been gone 11 days. 11 days. I want to tell you something before I go further. I'm not a bitter woman. I raised my daughter Renee with everything I had. Edmund and I both did. We were married for 41 years. He drove a postal route for 33 of them. I taught 4th grade for 27. We lived in the same house in Clover Hill, Virginia that we bought in 1989 for $94,000. We didn't have millions. We had what we built, a paid-off home worth $380,000 now, Edmund's pension survivor benefits, a life insurance policy for $240,000, and a small investment account Edmund had quietly added to for 20 years that had grown to just over $190,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was ours. And for someone like Gordon, who'd spent 15 years making promises he never kept, it was more than enough to want. I need to go back, because none of this started with Gordon on a phone call by the oak tree. It started when Renee brought him home for Thanksgiving in 2009. He was 34, recently divorced, working in business consulting, which he described differently each time someone asked. Edmund shook his hand and later told me quietly, "He's got the eyes of a man who's always calculating something." I told Edmund he was being uncharitable. Gordon was charming. He remembered details. He asked follow-up questions. He made Renee laugh in a way she hadn't laughed since college. They married in 2011. Edmund walked her down the aisle. I cried the whole way through. The early years were fine. They lived 40 minutes away in Fredericksburg. Gordon cycled through jobs, a marketing position that didn't fit his vision, a partnership that fell apart due to a bad actor, a consulting arrangement that was never properly formalized. Each time, Renee covered for him. Each time, Edmund and I sent a little help without being asked, because that's what you do. By 2016, Edmund was starting to notice things. Renee would call and mention they'd been late on the mortgage. Then she'd call back the next day and say it was fine. Gordon had handled it. Edmund started keeping a small notebook. I thought he was being paranoid. I was wrong. In 2019, Gordon started talking about Edmund's pension. Not directly. He'd say things at dinner like, "Have you and Renee's dad thought about what happens to the survivor benefits in different scenarios?" Or he'd send articles. One was titled, "Why Aging Couples Should Consider Consolidated Estate Plans." Edmund read it and set it face down on the table without a word. In 2021, Edmund was diagnosed with Parkinson's. Early stage. His hands trembled some mornings. He still drove, still did the crossword, still beat me at rummy every single Tuesday night. But the diagnosis changed something in the air around Gordon. He became suddenly very interested in being helpful. He drove Edmund to a doctor's appointment in the spring of 2022 and came back talking about next steps. He suggested we meet with an estate attorney he knew. Edmund said we already had one. Gordon said ours was probably not up to speed on current elder care law. Edmund looked at him over his glasses and said, "I'm 68 years old, Gordon, not a ward of the state." Gordon laughed, called it a generational thing. Edmund told me that night, Keep an eye on him, Syl. Edmund died on a Wednesday in October. He'd had a fall in the garage, a head injury, and he simply didn't come back from it. He was there on Tuesday evening watching the game, and then he wasn't there at all. 41 years, and then nothing but silence where he used to be. Renee arrived Thursday morning. Gordon arrived with her. He hugged me at the door and then went straight into Edmund's study. I was too deep in grief to ask why. The folders arrived on day 3. Gordon sat across from me at the dining room table with a pen already uncapped. He said Edmund's estate was time-sensitive. He said the investment account had terms that required action within 30 days of the account holder's death. He said the pension survivor transfer needed paperwork initiated quickly. He slid a document across the table. This just simplifies everything, he said. Puts things in Renee's name so you don't have to manage it alone. I asked if I could have a few days. He said, of course, but he left a pen. That evening, Helen knocked on the back door. After she told me what she'd heard, we sat there in the kitchen for a long time. Biscuit lay under the table. The sweet potato casserole on the counter had started to smell. Helen finally said, "Do you want to call someone?" I thought about who I trusted. My state attorney was Owen Bradshaw. Edmund and I had worked with him for 12 years. He was semi-retired, but still answered his phone. I called him at 8:17 that evening. He picked up on the second ring. "Sylvia," his voice was steady. "What's happened?" I told him about the folders. I read him the parts I could remember. There was a long pause. "Don't sign a single page," he said. "Not tonight, not tomorrow. Tell Gordon you're waiting for your attorney to review everything. Use my name." "He'll push back." "Let him push. That's what pushback looks like on paper, too." Owen was at my dining room table by 10 the next morning. He brought a colleague, a woman named Felicia Marsh, who specialized in elder law and estate fraud. She was in her early 50s, soft-spoken, and she read Gordon's documents the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, slowly, without expression, and then with a very deliberate exhale. "Mrs. Sylvia," she said, "this document does not simplify your estate. It transfers primary control of the investment account and assigns Gordon co-trustee authority alongside Renee. In the event you are deemed, and I want you to read this wording carefully, temporarily incapacitated due to grief-related cognitive impairment, all decisions revert to Gordon alone." I read it. Grief-related cognitive impairment. 11 days after my husband died, my son-in-law had drafted a clause that turned my grief into a legal liability. Owen set down his coffee cup. "There's more," he said. Felicia pulled out a second sheet, a letter on official stationery from a Dr. Victor Haynes. He described himself as a licensed therapist and grief counselor who had, according to the letter, conducted an initial consultation with me on October 19th. October 19th was the day of Edmund's funeral. I had never spoken to Dr. Victor Haynes in my life. I told Owen and Felicia that. Owen didn't look surprised. Felicia wrote something in her notepad. "This is a fabricated assessment," she said quietly. "It's designed to create a paper record of your incapacity before you've had any opportunity to contest it. If Gordon presents this alongside the estate documents, he has a basis to claim you signed under impaired judgment, which could be used either to enforce the transfer or to argue later that you need a guardian." A guardian. My husband was 11 days gone, and my son-in-law had already arranged for someone to call me incompetent on paper. I stood up from the table and walked to the window. Edmund's oak tree was in the backyard. He'd planted it the spring we moved in. It was taller than the house now. I heard Felicia say softly, "Mrs. Sylvia, I know this is a lot." I turned around. "Tell me what I need to do." What followed were 4 days I will not forget as long as I live. Owen contacted a private investigator named Ray Denton. He was 60, retired FBI, and he had the kind of face that made you feel like the room got quieter when he walked in. He met me at Owen's office on a Friday afternoon with a legal pad and a thermos of coffee and said, "Tell me everything you know about Gordon, and don't leave out the things you think don't matter." I talked for 2 hours. Ray didn't interrupt. When I finished, he looked at his notes and said, "Dr. Victor Haynes, do you know how Gordon knows him?" I didn't. "I'll find out," he said. "Give me 48 hours." Owen reached out quietly to my financial institution and discovered that Gordon had already called them twice, asking about co-account access for estate management and requesting information about withdrawal procedures for the investment account. The second call had been made 4 days after Edmund died. That was before Gordon had even shown me the folders. Ray called back in 36 hours. He had found 3 things, and he asked to meet in person. He used almost the exact same phrase my neighbor Helen had used. "This is bigger than he thought." We met Sunday morning at Owen's conference room. Ray set 3 folders on the table. He didn't dramatize it, he just opened the first one. Victor Haynes was not a licensed grief counselor. He held an expired mental health counselor certification from 2018 that had not been renewed. He had been the subject of 2 complaints with the Virginia Board of Counseling, both involving fabricated documentation for insurance purposes. Both complaints had been dismissed for insufficient evidence. Gordon had met him through a men's golf league in Spotsylvania County. Ray turned to the second folder. Gordon's financial history. In 2020, Gordon had opened an LLC called Meridian Asset Partners, registered in Delaware. He was listed as sole managing member. Between 2020 and 2023, he had transferred $47,000 in cash from a joint account with Renee into Meridian without her knowledge, the purpose listed on internal filings, consulting operations. There were no clients. There was no revenue. The money had moved to a separate personal account Gordon held alone. Ray set down a bank statement. "He's been building a parallel account for 3 years," he said. "He needed more. Renee's salary covers their household. But what he has access to through Renee isn't enough to cover what he owes." I asked what he owed. Ray opened the third folder. Gordon had borrowed $85,000 from a private lender in 2021, a man named Dennis Farrow, who operated a hard money lending operation out of Woodbridge. The terms were not conventional. The interest was compounding at a rate that had ballooned the balance to nearly $130,000 by October. Dennis Farrow had sent 2 written demands to Gordon's home address in September. Renee's name was not on the loan. Renee didn't know. Gordon needed money. He needed it before the end of the year. And the cleanest source he could find was the estate of his wife's dead father. I sat with that for a minute. Then I asked Ray, "Does Renee know any of this?" He paused. That pause told me more than his answer. "I don't believe she knows about the loan or Meridian," he said. "But she signed 2 documents in August, including one that added Gordon as a secondary financial contact for your investment account. She may not have understood what she was signing, or she may have trusted him when he explained it." I closed my eyes. My daughter. My Renee, who used to fall asleep on my lap during thunderstorms, who called me every Sunday at noon without fail, who stood at Edmund's grave and held my hand so hard her knuckles went white. Owen spoke carefully. "Sylvia, the question we need to think about is what you want to do with this." I opened my eyes. "I want him stopped. That means exposing this, in front of Renee, possibly in ways that damage your relationship." "I know. And it means timing matters. If Gordon tries to move on the estate documents before we've frozen the accounts." "Then we freeze the accounts first," I said. "Today." Felicia filed an emergency protective order on the investment account that afternoon through the circuit court. Owen contacted Edmund's pension administrator directly and flagged the file. The life insurance carrier was notified. Every door Gordon had been trying to open was quietly, legally shut. Monday morning, Gordon arrived at my house with a smile and a fresh copy of the estate documents. I'd made coffee. I set a cup in front of him and sat down across from him and said, "I've had an attorney review these." His smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "Oh," he said. Good. Did they have questions?" "A few," I said. "About the co-trustee language. About the grief-related incapacity clause. About the letter from Victor Haynes dated October 19th. Now the smile moved. "And about Meridian Asset Partners," I said, "and Dennis Farrow, and the $130,000. Gordon stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I practiced this. I said, "Sit down, Gordon. There are people on their way here who you'll want to be seated for." He didn't sit. He walked toward the front door. Owen's colleague was already on the porch. Ray Denton came around from the side yard. A sheriff's deputy who had been parked on the street walked up the front steps. I don't want to make this sound like a movie. It didn't feel like one. It felt like standing in a cold room in October with your hands steady and your heart breaking. Gordon was served with a civil fraud complaint that afternoon. The sheriff's deputy delivered a separate notice related to the falsified psychological assessment that had been referred to the state attorney general's office. Felicia had made 3 calls on Sunday. She was thorough. Renee arrived at my house at 4 o'clock. She didn't know what had happened. Gordon had called her, but whatever he'd said hadn't been the truth, because she came in with her coat still buttoned and her face confused rather than defensive. I sat her down at the kitchen table. Helen had been there all day and quietly left through the back door. I told Renee everything. I showed her the folders. I showed her the bank statements. I showed her the Victor Haynes letter, with the date she could verify herself, the morning of her father's funeral, when she and I had been standing at a graveside in the rain. She went very quiet. She looked at the Meridian account records. She looked at the $47,000. She said, "I signed something in August. He said it was insurance paperwork." I know. I didn't read it. I know, sweetheart. She put her hands flat on the table. For a long time she didn't say anything. Then she said, "How long have you known something was wrong?" "Your father knew," I said. "He kept a notebook." I got up and went to Edmund's study. I came back with a small spiral notebook he'd kept in his desk drawer. I set it in front of her. She opened it. His handwriting, careful and slow near the end, dates and observations going back to 2019. She read for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. Daddy knew. He always knew. She pressed the notebook to her chest. I want to say the hardest part was what came next, but honestly, the hardest part had already happened. It happened when I understood that my son-in-law had looked at my grief and seen an opening. What came next was just the long, slow work of aftermath. Gordon hired an attorney. The civil case took 8 months. The falsified psychological assessment was referred to the state licensing board, and because Victor Haynes held no valid license, to the Commonwealth's attorney for criminal fraud charges. He was eventually convicted of 1 count of falsifying a medical document and received a suspended sentence and a permanent ban from practice. It wasn't enough. But it was something. Gordon settled the civil fraud case in June of the following year. He agreed to repay the $47,000 he had moved through Meridian with interest. He signed over his share of any claim to Edmund's estate. In exchange, Renee agreed not to pursue criminal charges related to the estate documents, a decision I supported, not for Gordon's sake, but for Renee's. Renee filed for divorce in February. She found an apartment in Richmond, near her job. She called me every Sunday at noon, same as always. Except now sometimes we talked for 2 hours instead of 20 minutes. She started seeing a counselor, a real one. She told me once that the hardest thing to accept wasn't that Gordon had lied to her. It was that she had wanted so much to believe him that she'd stopped asking questions. I understood that. I had done the same thing for years. Helen came over for dinner most Friday nights that winter. We'd eat whatever I made and watch whatever was on, and she'd leave by 9 so Biscuit could have his last walk before bed. It was a quiet life. It was the life I had. In March, Owen called to tell me the estate had fully cleared. The investment account was intact. The pension was in my name, correctly, as Edmund had arranged it. The life insurance had been paid in October. I was, on paper, secure. I stood at the kitchen window when he told me. Edmund's oak tree had put out the first green of the year, tiny and tentative in the March cold. I thought about what Edmund had said on that Tuesday evening before he was gone. Keep an eye on him, Syl. I did, Edmund, just later than you'd hoped. Last spring, Renee drove up on a Saturday with coffee from the place she likes in Richmond. We sat on the back porch in the April sun. She was quieter than she used to be, but steadier. She'd gotten a promotion. She was taking a woodworking class on Saturdays, which I never would have predicted, and which somehow made perfect sense. She looked at her father's oak tree for a while. Then she said, "I keep thinking about what he saw in Gordon that I didn't." "He saw it," I said. He just didn't want to be right. She nodded slowly. "Mom," she said, "I'm sorry I didn't protect you." I reached over and put my hand over hers. Her hands were warm, the way they'd always been, even as a little girl in the middle of February. "You didn't know," I said. "I should have asked more questions." "We both should have," I said. "A long time ago." We sat there until the coffee was gone. Helen came over the fence with biscuit and joined us for the last of the afternoon. At some point, Renee laughed at something Helen said. A real laugh, the kind that catches you off guard. I thought, there it is. If you're watching this and you have someone in your life who makes you feel like you should stop asking questions, please ask them. Please. Grief makes us soft in ways that certain people recognize and exploit. Edmund saw it coming and I didn't listen hard enough, and it almost cost me everything he spent his life building. But here's what Gordon didn't calculate. 32 years of a neighbor who walks her dog past your side yard every morning. A husband who kept a notebook. An attorney who picks up his phone at 8 at night. And a daughter who, when she finally saw the truth, chose it. That's not nothing. That's everything. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you subscribe to Emerald Revenge. There are more stories here, stories about people who thought they were out of options and found out they weren't. Leave me a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if you're going through something like this right now, don't sign anything. Call someone you trust. The paperwork can wait. Your clarity cannot. I still think about the pen Gordon left on my dining room table. He uncapped it before he even sat down. That detail didn't register at the time. I was 11 days into the worst grief of my life, and my mind was moving through fog. But later, when I could think clearly again, that uncapped pen told me everything about who he was. A man who had already decided the outcome before the conversation began. What happened to me didn't happen because I was weak. It happened because I was human. Grief softens the edges of your judgment in ways you don't feel until someone tries to walk through them. Gordon counted on that. He had been counting on it for years, watching Edmund decline, running his calculations, building his paper trail. He thought losing Edmund would make me easy. He was wrong, but only because of a dog walker and a 32-year friendship, and a man named Edmund who kept a small spiral notebook in his desk drawer. I thought a lot about what actually protected me, and it wasn't money or status or being unusually smart. It was character, mine and the people around me. Helen could have kept walking that morning. She could have kept walking that morning. She could have told herself it wasn't her business. She didn't. Owen could have said, "Call me Monday." He didn't. Ray Denton could have given me a surface-level answer to spare my feelings about Renee. He didn't. Every person who helped me made a choice to be honest when dishonesty would have been easier. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. And Renee. I think about Renee most of all. She wasn't innocent, but she wasn't the villain either, and understanding the difference between those two things required more from me than exposing Gordon ever did. She had stopped asking questions because she wanted to believe someone who made her feel seen. I understand that impulse. I had done the same thing for years when Gordon said things that didn't add up. We both paid for it. The difference was, she had a mother who chose the harder kind of love, the kind that shows you the truth, even when it costs something. What I know now is that clarity is not something that just happens to you. You have to choose it, especially when you're hurting, especially when someone is handing you a pen and a reason to stop thinking. Edmund chose clarity for 41 years. He wrote things down when his hands were already shaking because he knew that the mind that built something has a responsibility to protect it. That kind of discipline, quiet, unglamorous, consistent, is what actually kept Gordon from winning. I'm 63 years old. I lost my husband. I nearly lost everything he spent his life building. And what I came out with, besides the house and the accounts and the oak tree in the backyard, was a clearer understanding of what holds a life together. It isn't paperwork. It isn't money. It's the people who knock on your back door when it would be easier to keep walking. It's the willingness to ask one more question when your instincts say something is off. And it's the kind of backbone that lets you sit across from someone who counted you out and say, quietly, without raising your voice, "Sit down." Edmund always said the truth has a way of keeping its appointments. I believe that now more than I ever did.